Well, good afternoon. My name is Sandy Prislaw. I'm the environmental planner in Old Saybrook. Prior to that, I had actually worked with Juliana and others at the Center for Land Use Education and Research. So this is kind of a homecoming in a way. Every once in a while, they call me out of retirement and ask me to come talk. So glad to be here. I just have a quick question. I'm curious, always curious about an audience that I talk to. How many of you are officials in a community? Okay, and that's when I say officials, either an elected official or a volunteer on a board or a commission. Oh, more hands. Let me rephrase my question. How many of you are elected officials in a community, coastal community?
Those are two good questions.
Okay, and how many of you are volunteers on a local board or commission in a coastal community? So everybody else is either academia or just an interested party who's here, or an engineering firm. And staff. Oh yeah, staff. How many people are staff in a local community? Like me, I'm a staff. I'm also a volunteer in my town, but okay. So we have a good cross-section of people representing various different walks of life, but all concerned with what's happening along the coast and how living shorelines might be able to help. I have to be very honest with you. When Juliana first asked me to speak today, I said, what can I talk about? I don't know anything about living shorelines, and that's the truth. But I've actually, over the last few months, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot this morning about living shorelines. I've learned a lot more. That's a good thing. And I hope everybody else has learned a lot as well. In terms of how I've gotten started with looking at coastal processes or being concerned about them, in my time in the town of Old Saybrook, one of the tasks that I was working on a couple of years ago was an update to the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan. We were updating the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, and some residents in town actually stopped to attend a couple of meetings, which was unusual because these were staff meetings for the most part, or committee meetings talking about changes that would probably be appropriate for the plan. A couple of members of the community came in and asked, what are you doing about sea level rise? Well, the committee hadn't considered that. As a result of the concern on the part of citizens in the town, what we did is we added to our natural hazard mitigation plan a section, a new hazard, if you will, a slow motion hazard called sea level rise. And so I've gotten involved with looking at natural hazards and sea level rise, and now looking at things like living shorelines, because living shorelines may be a technique that can be used in a town like Old Saybrook to help deal with the effects of present-day conditions as well as future conditions from sea level rise. So what I want to talk about is what are the existing conditions in the town, what are some of the resiliency efforts that we're exploring, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. And at the very bottom it says how we're going to get there. Lots of questions, and I think Denise, you said there's few answers. And I've heard that from several other people as well. Lots of questions and not too many answers as yet. So where are we? Let me talk a little bit about Old Saybrook. This is a shaded relief map that shows you the elevation, more or less, of the town. And as you can see, the areas along Long Island Sound to the south, relatively flat, and relatively flat up along the Connecticut River as well. We have about 6-7 miles of shoreline on Long Island Sound and a much longer shoreline on the Connecticut River. So we're kind of in this unique environment in which we have to be concerned with what's happening on Long Island Sound and what's happening in a riverine environment at the mouth of the river. It's kind of a unique intersection of coastal and riverine. And it's a big river, as we know, and we have flooding issues in the river as well as flooding issues on the coast. In terms of some statistics about the town, we're about 10,000 in population. About 77% of the buildings are located south of Route 95, which is that red line. And about 12% of the buildings, these are residential buildings primarily, are within about 300 feet of the shoreline. So we have a significant portion of the town's population that lives year-round or seasonally very, very close to the shore. This shows you, which I've added to this, is the green, which shows the tidal wetlands in Old Saybrook. We have an extensive system of tidal wetlands, almost all of which are surrounded by the purple and mustard colors, which represent either commercial or urban development. All right, so that's kind of the physical setting of the town. In terms of our shorelines, I characterize the shorelines, and I'm not an engineer, I'm not a coastal geologist or a coastal engineer, so this is just my interpretation, which is subject to your interpretation, or filtering, if you will. The low energy shorelines are found primarily in North Cove and South Cove, the two areas that have the green lines surrounding them now. I would call those low energy environments from a wave perspective. They're relatively protected, they're surrounded by land. There's not a lot of fetch. I learned that word, fetch. Not a lot of area for waves to build up from wind. And then we have down along the Connecticut River what I would classify as a medium energy shoreline. Again, it's relatively protected from wind, from fetch, but you still get some significant storms that can impact it, and a lot of boat traffic. So the Connecticut River can be like Route 95 in the summertime, with boats just going up and down, pretty much 24 hours a day. So it's a very, very busy recreational boating river. And then the high energy shorelines along Long Island Sound, and it runs from the eastern point of Fenwick, the borough of Fenwick, along a coastal bluff on the most southern, and then the, let's see, it would be southwestern facing is more of a beach environment, a sand environment. So that's the, more or less a gross overview of the types of shorelines that we have in terms of their energy characteristics. We have some natural shorelines that still exist, a few. These areas, Ragged Rock Creek, which is right in the middle of the map where the text just came up, that's a large tidal marsh. It's got a natural shoreline facing the river. And then Ferry Point and Saybrook Points, which have now been labeled on the map, those are riverine areas, but they're highly developed, heavily armored, not natural at all. So I have three categories of energy environments, and then two categories of natural versus hardened. Some of the things that we're looking at in terms of mitigation, I think are probably things that all coastal communities in Connecticut are dealing with today. Building code, we have in Old Saybrook we enforce the state building code, which now requires a foot of freeboard in special flood hazard areas. Elevating buildings to be compliant with FEMA flood insurance program requirements is going on a regular basis. We have a lot of groins along the shoreline, try to keep sand in place. And we have a lot of shoreline hardening. So I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of what these things look like in Old Saybrook, and then we'll talk about what are some of the implications of those things. We also have some actions to protect natural areas. There's some dune and wetland restoration that's taken place primarily out on Fenwick, and I think, Juliana, you were involved in some of that years back. And there's a real effort on the part of the town to preserve what little open space is left in the coastal area, to try to preserve that as open space. The last bullet I have up there says living shorelines not yet. Well, that's not quite accurate. There are a couple of examples of things that have been done in town. And as I'm learning the terminology better, I can start plugging in more things and say, well, that's a living shoreline. I didn't know it, but that's a living shoreline. So, all right, so let's take a look. Now I'm going to take you on a visual tour of Old Saybrook. So bear with me. What you have, this is over on the, let's see, I gotta get my directions right, the western side of town. This is an area called Chalker Beach. And what you're seeing up there, the dark lines that are superimposed on the aerial photograph, those represent some kind of a hardened shoreline. Either it's a concrete wall, a bulkhead, stones, something. And then all of the perpendicular structures going out into the sound, primarily wooden groins. So here's a pictometry, aerial oblique image of that same area. You can clearly see the low seawalls that have been constructed here. And on the ground shot from the Chalker Beach. looking down at some of the houses where at high tide, the water's right up to the base of or a little ways up some of the seawalls. Moving along, this is Plum Bank. This is now, we're moving to the east. There are two beaches that are, excuse me, two beaches, Harvey's Beach here and Town Beach over here. Those are two public beaches in the town. Most of the shoreline, like most of Connecticut towns, most of the shoreline is privately owned. And that was my question earlier this morning. I was curious with living shorelines, and we'll talk more about this in a second, who starts the request for a living shoreline? In Greenwich, there was a town property that you're trying to protect. In Old Saybrook, the town's ownership of property along the shore is very, very small. It's privately owned. And yet the need for protection is just as true for private property owners as it is for municipalities. So anyway, here's an aerial oblique again, Harvey's Beach right there. And I noticed, Kevin, in some of the data that you were talking about this morning, this is an area that's had a lot of shoreline loss, the Harvey Beach area specifically. And here's a picture of what it looks like on the ground. Extensive tidal flats offshore. Very, very shallow water. Lots of sand in this location. As we move again further to the east, this is an area, Cornfield Point, going around to Knollwood. This is a coastal bluff, a terminal moraine probably from last glaciation. Here we are looking at an aerial view. You can see there's a very, very rocky shoreline here. We don't have concrete seawalls, lots of stone, a view from the ground, no sand. So this must be, I would assume if there's no sand, it must be a pretty high energy area. The sand is all being carried out, washed away, been carried out to the beach areas. And as we move along now along the shore to Knollwood, you can see this is State Highway 156, 4, I never remember the number. It runs right along, it's a scenic highway, it runs right along the shore. Beautiful to drive. This is a view taken by a planning commission member in town, standing at the top of the seawall after Storm Sandy. You can see the erosion that's taken place. Now this seawall is probably 20 feet high. So it's a huge seawall. The state has spent significant money restoring following the Storm Sandy. All right, continuing on our tour, we'll head out towards Fenwick, Juliana's stomping ground. And even out there we have a lot of hardened shorelines, a lot of seawall construction. And here's a photograph of just a few weeks ago, going out there with Joel Stocker and Jennifer O'Donnell, taking a look at the seawall. It's a pretty big one. And again, in this area we have a tidal range of 3.5, 4 feet, so unlike Greenwich, it's a much smaller tidal range. Here's a picture of Fenwick during, I'm not sure if this was Storm Sandy or Tropical Storm Irene, high energy zone. And here's a picture of the seawall following the storm. Now, from what I'm learning about living shorelines, these are probably not areas that would be appropriate for a living shoreline. Too much energy, too much wave action, too much exposure to storms. As we move a little bit further east, we get to an area where there's a sand dune where the star is on the map, and that's a dune that has gone through some extensive restoration work over the years. There's a creek behind the sand dune that connects up, if we were to follow this across Fenwick, connects to South Cove, so that the pond behind the house flushes, or I should say it doesn't flush, but it's tidal. And during Storm Irene and Tropical Storm Irene and Sandy, this dune got pushed back to actually fill in that creek. Here's a picture of it following Tropical Storm Irene. I guess it had a lot of coir logs in it that during the restoration phase have been exposed. The dune held, and it's still there today, and that's what it looks like now. However, it's an area that is constantly exposed to wave storm action, but it might be an area that would be okay for some kind of an offshore living shoreline solution because it's a very, very shallow offshore area. And lastly, just a quick one, up on the Connecticut River, this is the northern part of the Ragged Rock Tidal Creek. And if we look at that, an aerial oblique, and then another aerial photo courtesy of Joel Stocker. This is a natural shoreline along the river. It's exposed to a lot of boat wakes. And when I compared this to the 1990 aerial orthophotography, visually you can see that there's been a lot of retreat of the shore of the marsh's shoreline moving to the west. So it's been eroding slowly over time. Now, whether any kind of living shoreline treatment in this area would be appropriate, I don't know. I mean, this is a living shoreline, right? But it's exposed to a lot of wave action. So as I said, a lot of questions and not too many answers. One of the things I learned a little bit better this morning was the definition of a living shoreline being used here in Connecticut. But one of my questions was, what qualifies for a living shoreline? Does it have to be constructed by people to be a living shoreline? Does a hybrid system with some kind of stone or concrete with something living behind it? Anyway, the definition is something that I think that we all need to spend some time on. What types of living shorelines work in various energy zone settings? What I've learned this morning, high energy zones, probably not. Low energy, moderate energy, much more likely that you can find a solution there. Question for us in Old Saybrook, where would it work in that town, our town? And that's where, from the municipal perspective, we need guidance. Because, as Denise said, the elected officials, sea level rise, living shorelines, that's not an everyday concern. It's only a concern following a Storm Sandy or Tropical Storm Irene. So you get a big event, you have a lot of damage, and it's, oh boy, we're concerned about this. But day to day, it's off most people's radar. So where do we put these things in Old Saybrook? How do we get that process started? How do we get people thinking about it? How are sites evaluated and selected for a living shoreline? How are these things permitted? Who benefits and who pays? If we have all private ownership, is it the property owner? Is it his or her responsibility? Is it a municipal responsibility in collaboration with the property owner? Is it the town, municipality, and property owner? Questions that I don't have answers for. How's sea level rise going to impact living shorelines? And lastly, I took this from Juliana actually, what if everybody just wants a seawall? The situation in Old Saybrook right now is most everybody already has one. What if they want to keep that seawall? And the thing I put at the very end is that we as staff, as volunteers, as elected officials, as academia, as consultants, we need to change people's perceptions of what's the right thing to do, what's the best thing to do to both protect private property and facilities on the shore, public facilities on the shore, as well as enhance the environment. And I think that's where I end up. Thank you.